The phone rang at exactly 11:47 on a cold Thursday night. At my age, people rarely call that late unless something terrible has happened. For a moment, I considered letting it ring. Most of the people who once filled my life were already gone, and I had long grown accustomed to quiet evenings alone. Then I saw an unfamiliar number flashing across my screen. Something in my heart immediately told me to answer. Hello. For several seconds, all I heard was crying. Soft, broken, desperate. Grandpa. The moment I heard her voice, I sat upright in my chair. Emily? What's wrong? She couldn't stop crying. I had never heard my granddaughter sound so frightened before. Grandpa, please don't hang up. I'm right here, sweetheart. Tell me what happened. There was another painful silence before she finally whispered the words that made my heart stop. I'm at the police station. For several moments, I couldn't speak. What happened? I asked quietly. They said I stole money from my company, she sobbed. They're going to charge me tomorrow morning. I immediately stood to my feet. What? I didn't do it, Grandpa. I swear I didn't do anything wrong. There are moments in life when the people we love don't need our questions. They simply need us to believe them. This was one of those moments. I know, I answered without hesitation. She began crying even harder. Nobody believes me. Those 4 words hurt me more than she could ever imagine. Nobody believes me. I knew exactly how those words felt. 9 years earlier, I had spoken almost those same words to people I loved. I still remember the silence that followed. Some wounds never truly heal. They simply become easier to carry. Where are your parents? I asked. There was another long pause before she finally answered. They don't want me to call them anymore. My heart immediately broke. What do you mean? They think I really did it. For the second time that night, I found myself unable to speak. Emily had always been different from the rest of our family. She was kind, stubborn, and honest, almost to a fault. Even as a little girl, she would cry whenever she accidentally broke something because she couldn't bear allowing someone else to take the blame. She simply wasn't capable of stealing anything from anyone. I'm sorry for calling so late, she whispered through her tears. I didn't know who else to call. I smiled sadly as I looked toward the family photograph resting beside my lamp. You never have to apologize for calling me. Grandpa, listen to me carefully, sweetheart. Okay, no matter what happens tonight, I want you to remember one thing. What is it? You are not alone. The silence that followed somehow said more than words ever could. Do you believe me? She finally asked. There are questions we answer with our minds. Others we answer with our hearts. Always. I heard her begin crying once again. Thank you. I quietly grabbed my coat hanging beside the front door before asking one final question. Which police station? Grandpa, you don't have to come. I couldn't help but laugh softly at her words. Of course I do. It's almost midnight. I know. It's freezing outside. I know. You're 70 years old. That finally made me laugh. And you're still my granddaughter. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered something that I will never forget for the rest of my life. I knew you would come. Perhaps she never realized how much those words meant to me. There are many things money can never buy. One of them is knowing that somewhere in this world, someone still believes you'll come when they need you most. 10 minutes later, I locked my front door and quietly walked toward my old pickup truck parked beside the house. The cold wind brushed against my face as memories I had spent years trying to bury slowly returned once again. A frightened child, false accusations, a family divided by misunderstanding, and a future hanging by a thread. It was strange how life sometimes repeats itself in ways we never expect. Emily believed she was calling her grandfather that night. She had no idea she was calling the only person willing to sacrifice everything to protect her. Not again. Never again. As I started my truck and began driving toward the police station, I silently made myself a promise. I had already lost too much protecting the people I love. I wasn't going to lose my granddaughter too. The police station was almost empty when I arrived shortly after midnight. The young officer sitting behind the front desk looked surprised when I quietly told him my granddaughter's name. Are you her grandfather? He asked. Yes. He glanced at me for several seconds before looking down at the paperwork resting before him. You came alone? I smiled politely. Should I have brought someone else? For reasons I couldn't quite explain, he seemed uncomfortable answering that question. No, sir. It's just... He hesitated before continuing. Most people don't come this late unless they're immediate family. I quietly smiled to myself. After all these years, I had learned something important about family. Sharing the same last name means very little if we aren't willing to show up when someone needs us most. She is my family, I answered softly. Several moments later, he escorted me toward one of the small waiting rooms at the end of the hallway. Nothing could have prepared me for what I saw when the door slowly opened. Emily was sitting alone beside the wall with tears filling her eyes. Her beautiful dark hair was a mess, and she looked more frightened than I had ever seen her before. The moment she saw me standing there, she immediately broke down crying. "Grandpa." I opened my arms without saying a single word. She ran toward me and held me so tightly that my heart immediately broke all over again. For several minutes, she simply cried against my shoulder like she had done when she was only 6 years old after falling from her bicycle. Some things never change. No matter how old they become, our grandchildren will always remain children whenever their hearts are hurting. "I'm sorry," she whispered repeatedly through her tears. "What are you apologizing for?" "For ruining everyone's life." I gently pulled away before placing my hands upon her shoulders. "Look at me." Slowly, she raised her eyes toward mine. "You have ruined nothing. But you called me because you needed help. There will never come a day when you need to apologize for that." More tears slowly fell down her face as she quietly nodded. For the next hour, she carefully explained everything that had happened. Several $1,000s had disappeared from her company's accounts only 3 days earlier. Someone had used her employee credentials to authorize multiple financial transactions shortly before the money vanished completely. Every piece of evidence pointed directly toward her. "I didn't do any of it," she whispered once again. "I know. You haven't even seen the evidence." I smiled softly before taking her hand in mine. "I don't need to." "How can you be so sure?" Because I had asked myself that same question many years ago. The truth is that love doesn't always need evidence. Sometimes it simply knows. Before I could answer her question, the door suddenly opened once again. A man and woman quickly walked into the room without bothering to look in my direction. Emily immediately lowered her eyes toward the floor. It was her parents. "Emily!" her mother cried before embracing her tightly. Then something happened that surprised me more than I care to admit. Neither of them acknowledged my presence. Not even once. They simply pretended I wasn't standing only a few feet away from them. For a brief moment, I wondered whether I should feel hurt. Then I remembered that I had grown accustomed to such things many years ago. My relationship with the rest of my family had never truly recovered after certain decisions I made long ago. Some sacrifices protect the people we love, while simultaneously pushing them further away from us. I had accepted that reality years earlier. Finally, my son-in-law looked toward me and quietly spoke. "You shouldn't be here." Emily immediately turned toward him in shock. "What?" "This has nothing to do with him." I remained silent. "He's my grandfather," she replied angrily. "And he's 70 years old," he answered. "There is absolutely nothing he can do to help us tonight." I couldn't help but smile sadly to myself. How strange life can sometimes be. People often look at an old man and see only his age. They never stop to wonder about the experiences he carries or the sacrifices hidden behind his quiet smile. He wasn't being cruel. He simply believed I was exactly what everyone else believed me to be. A lonely old man living quietly in retirement. Emily immediately grabbed my hand before speaking once again. Grandpa was the first person who came when I called. The room suddenly became silent. No one knew how to respond to her words. Looking back now, perhaps that was the moment I realized something far more important than Emily's innocence was waiting to reveal itself. This wasn't simply about saving my granddaughter anymore. It was about saving my family. And somehow, I had the strange feeling that our greatest battle had not even begun. I spent the rest of that night sitting beside my granddaughter inside the small waiting room. No matter how many years pass, there is something strangely comforting about simply knowing that the people we love are sitting safely beside us. Emily had finally stopped crying, but I could still see the fear hiding behind her smile whenever she thought no one was looking. Fear has a way of making us feel alone, even when an entire room is standing beside us. I knew that feeling better than most people ever would. Several hours passed before one of the detectives entered the room, carrying a thick file filled with documents. "I'm afraid things aren't looking very good," he said politely. Emily immediately lowered her eyes toward the floor once again. "The evidence is overwhelming." My son-in-law quietly placed his hand upon her shoulder before asking the question everyone in the room was afraid to hear. "What happens next?" "If we cannot prove her innocence before tomorrow afternoon, formal charges will be filed." For several moments, the entire room became silent. Tomorrow afternoon. It was difficult to believe that an entire future could disappear in less than 24 hours. Emily was only 26 years old. She had spent years building both her career and her reputation. One accusation was all it would take to destroy everything she had worked so hard to achieve. Some people never truly recover from being falsely accused. I would know. After the detective left the room, my daughter quietly began crying beside her husband. "I don't know what we're going to do," she whispered softly. I wanted desperately to comfort her. There was a time when she would have immediately fallen into my arms whenever she was frightened. Unfortunately, that time belonged to another lifetime. The years have a cruel way of placing distance between people who once loved each other deeply. Finally, my son-in-law broke the uncomfortable silence filling the room. "We've already hired the best attorney we could afford." "And?" I asked quietly. He hesitated for several seconds before answering. "He doesn't believe we'll win." Emily immediately turned away as fresh tears began falling down her face once again. "No one believes me," she whispered softly. "No," I immediately corrected her. "That isn't true." For the first time since arriving at the police station, she smiled once again. Because despite everything that had happened throughout my life, there was still one thing that had never changed. I believed her. Always. Several minutes later, Emily quietly rested her head against my shoulder. "You've always believed me," she whispered, "because you've never given me a reason not to." She smiled softly before asking a question I wasn't expecting. "Grandpa, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Were you scared?" The question caught me completely by surprise. Scared of what? When people stop believing you. For several moments I couldn't find the words to answer her question. The truth was that I had been terrified. Not because people stopped believing me, but because I was afraid the people I loved would spend the rest of their lives carrying the pain created by my choices. Some fears never completely leave us. "They didn't stop believing who I was," I finally answered softly. "They simply didn't know the whole truth." She quietly nodded as though somehow understanding more than I intended to tell her. "You've always protected everyone else," she whispered. "Who protected you?" The question immediately brought tears to my eyes. I smiled softly before gently squeezing her hand. "You did." "What?" "Every time you smiled when I came to visit. Every birthday card you sent me. Every phone call asking whether I was eating properly." She immediately began crying once again. "You were the only person who never stopped calling me Grandpa." The truth was that Emily had no idea how much those small moments had carried me through the darkest years of my life. She had been only a child when so many terrible things happened within our family. Yet somehow, she never allowed the distance growing between everyone else to change the love she carried inside her heart. Looking back now, perhaps she had been protecting me all along without ever realizing it. That night, as I watched her slowly fall asleep beside me inside the waiting room, I quietly made another promise to myself. No matter what it cost me, no matter what secrets I was forced to reveal, no matter what sacrifices I was required to make, I would not allow history to repeat itself. My granddaughter was going home, and for the first time in many years, I began to realize that perhaps the greatest secret within our family was waiting not to destroy us, but finally to bring us back together once again. 9 years earlier, I wasn't living alone in a quiet little house at the edge of town. My life had been very different back then. I wasn't wealthy enough to appear on the cover of business magazines, nor was I powerful enough to have my name remembered by strangers. But I had everything I had ever wanted. I had my wife, I had my daughter, and I had a beautiful little granddaughter who loved waiting beside the front door every Sunday afternoon just to run into my arms. Life was simple, and for me, that had always been more than enough. Emily was only 17 years old when everything began to change. She had always dreamed of becoming an attorney one day. She used to spend hours sitting beside me, asking questions about justice, honesty, and what it meant to become a good person. "Grandpa," she once asked while helping me water the flowers in our garden, "why do good people sometimes suffer?" It remains one of the most difficult questions I have ever been asked. I smiled before answering her the only way I knew how. "Because life isn't always fair, sweetheart." "Then why should people still choose to be good?" This time, my answer came without hesitation. "Because becoming a good person should never depend upon how other people treat us." She smiled proudly before writing those words inside the small notebook she carried everywhere she went. Years later, I would discover she had never forgotten them. Life continued peacefully until the day I received a phone call that changed our entire family forever. It wasn't from my daughter. It wasn't from my granddaughter. It was from a man I had spent decades trying to forget. I still remember hearing his voice for the first time after so many years. "We need to talk." "No," I immediately answered before hanging up the phone. Some people deserve second chances. Others have already been given more than they ever deserved. I believed he belonged to the second group. Unfortunately, life rarely asks our permission before reopening old wounds. Only 2 days later, he appeared outside my home carrying an envelope that immediately brought back memories I had spent years trying to bury. "Please," he whispered softly, "just hear me out." I almost closed the door in his face. Almost. Then he quietly spoke 6 words that immediately changed everything. "It's about your granddaughter, Emily." The moment I heard her name, I knew I could no longer walk away. He slowly handed me the envelope, resting in his hands, before lowering his eyes toward the ground. Inside were copies of financial documents I immediately recognized. At first, I couldn't understand what I was looking at. Then my heart slowly began to sink. Someone had been carefully watching my granddaughter for almost 6 months. Someone had been preparing to destroy her future long before she ever walked into that police station. "This isn't possible," I whispered softly. "I'm afraid it is." "Who's behind this?" For several moments, he remained silent before finally answering. "The same people who destroyed both of our lives." Suddenly, I understood everything. This wasn't about stolen money. This wasn't about a misunderstanding. And it certainly wasn't an unfortunate accident. Emily hadn't become their victim by chance. She had become their target. The most frightening part of all was finally realizing why. They weren't trying to punish her. They were trying to punish me. I quietly sat down without saying another word as memories from many years earlier slowly returned once again. Some secrets remain hidden because we are ashamed of them. Others remain hidden because revealing them would only place the people we love in danger. For many years, I believed protecting my family meant protecting them from the truth. Now, for the second time in my life, I was beginning to understand that the truth had finally come looking for us. Looking back now, perhaps I should have known this day would eventually arrive. After all, dangerous secrets have a terrible habit of finding their way home. For the rest of that evening, I sat alone staring at the documents spread across my dining table. There was one question I couldn't stop asking myself. If they had truly spent 6 months preparing to destroy my granddaughter's future, then why had they waited until now? The answer frightened me more than I cared to admit, because they knew I was home. For 9 years, I had remained nothing more than a forgotten old man, living quietly in the shadows of his own life. Then suddenly, I returned home. And only days later, Emily found herself sitting inside a police station accused of committing a crime she would never have been capable of committing. That wasn't a coincidence. Someone was sending me a message. The man sitting across from me quietly broke the uncomfortable silence filling the room. "They've been waiting for this moment. How long have you known?" "Almost 6 months." I slowly raised my eyes toward him in disbelief. "And you didn't tell me?" His face immediately filled with regret. "You were finally beginning to rebuild your life. I hoped I could stop this before it reached your family." Unfortunately, hope has never been much stronger than the truth. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly placed one final document before me. "This is why they've come back." The moment I opened the file, I immediately understood everything. Hidden among the financial records was a familiar signature I had hoped never to see again. Mine, not my current signature. The one I had used almost 10 years earlier. "They've been waiting for you to come home," he whispered softly. I slowly closed my eyes as memories I had spent nearly a decade trying to bury returned once again. I had sacrificed my freedom because I believed I could protect my family. Perhaps I had only delayed their suffering instead. That thought frightened me more than prison ever had. "You need to tell them the truth," he finally said quietly. "No, you can't keep protecting everyone forever." I smiled sadly at his words. Perhaps he was right. But fathers and grandfathers rarely stop protecting the people they love simply because someone tells them they should. For 9 years, I had carried my secret alone. I could carry it a little longer if it meant protecting Emily. No one else needs to suffer because of my mistakes. This was never your mistake. That doesn't matter anymore. Before he could argue with me once again, I quietly stood to my feet and walked toward the small wooden box resting inside my study. There are only 3 things inside that box. A photograph of my wife, the final letter she ever wrote to me, and the truth that could destroy everything my family believes about the last 9 years of my life. I slowly opened it before removing the sealed envelope resting quietly beneath her photograph. 9 years earlier, I promised myself that I would never open that envelope again unless my family's future depended upon it. Unfortunately, that day had finally arrived. My granddaughter had no idea what I had sacrificed to protect her future, long before she was ever accused of stealing anything. She didn't know that every important moment in her life had been quietly watched over by someone she believed had nothing left to give. I was there when she graduated from law school. I sat quietly in the last row because I didn't want to make anyone uncomfortable by attending. I was there when she received her first promotion at work. She never saw the flowers I left anonymously outside her office that morning. And I was there when she cried beside her grandmother's grave asking whether she would ever make me proud. Some sacrifices aren't made once. They're made every single day. People often believe sacrifice means giving something away and walking away forever. They're wrong. Real sacrifice means choosing the people you love every single day, even when they never know you've made that choice at all. I had spent 9 years choosing my family, and I would gladly spend the rest of my life doing exactly the same thing. That night, I finally made my decision. I wasn't going to allow Emily to sacrifice her future because of choices I had made many years ago. Not while I was still breathing. If I needed to reveal the truth to save her, then so be it. If I needed to sacrifice everything once again, then so be it. After all, I had never stopped being her grandfather, and I wasn't about to fail her now. I arrived at the police station before sunrise the following morning. Emily was sitting quietly beside the window holding a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The moment she saw me walking toward her, she immediately smiled. It was a tired smile, the kind people wear when they're trying to convince everyone around them that they're stronger than they really are. "You didn't sleep at all, did you?" I asked softly. She laughed quietly before shaking her head. "Neither did you." "No." For the first time since receiving her phone call, she looked strangely peaceful sitting beside me that morning. "Grandpa?" "Yes?" "If they charge me today, will you promise me something?" "What is it?" "Promise me you won't blame yourself." Her words immediately caught me by surprise. "What makes you think I would?" She smiled sadly before lowering her eyes toward the floor. "Because that's what you've always done." I couldn't help but laugh softly at her answer. It was strange how children sometimes understand us better than we understand ourselves. "Emily," I said quietly, "there's something I've been wanting to ask you." "What is it?" "Why did you call me?" The question seemed to surprise her. "What do you mean?" "Your parents were here. You have wonderful friends and talented attorneys. Why me?" She remained silent for several moments before finally answering. "Because you always come." There wasn't anything extraordinary about her answer, and perhaps that's why it affected me so deeply. "Because you always come." I wondered whether she realized those 5 simple words had become the greatest compliment anyone had ever given me. Suddenly, I found myself remembering another conversation we shared many years ago. Emily had been only 8 years old when she fell asleep waiting for me to attend her school play. My car had broken down almost 30 miles away, and by the time I finally arrived, everyone else had already gone home. She was sitting quietly beside her teacher when I walked through the front doors of the school. "I'm sorry," I told her repeatedly while carrying her to my truck. "That's okay." "No, sweetheart. I promised I would be here." She smiled sleepily before resting her head upon my shoulder. "But you came." Even at 8 years old, she had already understood something many adults spend their entire lives learning. Love doesn't always arrive on time, but it always arrives. I smiled softly at the memory before looking toward her once again. "Thank you," I whispered quietly. "What for?" "For never giving up on me." Before she could ask another question, one of the detectives entered the room carrying several documents. "I'm afraid we've run out of time." The entire room immediately became silent. "If new evidence isn't presented before noon, formal charges will proceed exactly as scheduled." Noon. We had less than 4 hours remaining. My daughter immediately began crying once again, while my son-in-law quietly buried his face in his hands. For the first time since this nightmare began, I could finally see the fear they had been desperately trying to hide. They weren't afraid of losing money. They weren't afraid of losing their reputation. They were afraid of losing their daughter. Suddenly, none of the misunderstandings of the last 9 years seemed particularly important anymore. Pain has a strange way of reminding us what truly matters. Without saying another word, I quietly stood to my feet. "Grandpa?" Emily asked in confusion. "I'll be back." "Where are you going?" "There are some things I should have done many years ago." For several moments, everyone simply stared at me in confusion. "What things?" my daughter finally asked softly. I smiled sadly before answering the question I had avoided for almost a decade. "The truth." No one understood what I meant. Not yet. Less than 30 minutes later, I arrived at my attorney's office carrying the small wooden box that had remained locked for 9 long years. He immediately looked toward me in complete disbelief. "Are you sure about this?" "No." "Then why are you doing it?" I smiled quietly before opening the box resting in my hands. "Because my granddaughter needs me." He slowly looked down at the sealed envelope I had protected for so many years before asking one final question. "Do you realize what will happen once everyone learns the truth?" "Yes." "And you're willing to lose everything you've spent 9 years rebuilding?" I couldn't help but laugh softly at his words. They've never understood me very well. What do you mean? I've never been protecting my life. Slowly, I picked up the envelope resting beside my wife's photograph. I've always been protecting theirs. For 9 years, that envelope represented every sacrifice I had ever made. Today, it would become the very thing that saved my granddaughter's future. And for the first time in many years, I wasn't afraid of the truth anymore. I was finally ready to let it speak for itself. By the time I returned to the police station, it was nearly 11:30 in the morning. Less than 30 minutes remained before my granddaughter's future would be placed in the hands of strangers. For the first time since receiving her phone call, I wasn't afraid anymore. After carrying my secret for 9 long years, I had finally realized something important. The truth doesn't become less painful simply because we hide it. Sometimes, all we do is delay the day we are forced to face it. When I entered the waiting room once again, everyone immediately stood to their feet. Emily smiled softly before walking toward me. "You came back." I laughed quietly at her words. "I told you I would." She immediately noticed the small wooden box resting in my hands. "What's that?" Before I could answer her question, my attorney quietly stepped into the room behind me carrying several documents of his own. The detective's expression immediately changed the moment he saw him. "I believe we have something you'd like to see," my attorney said calmly. For the next several minutes, no one spoke as the documents were carefully placed across the conference table. "What exactly is all of this?" my son-in-law finally asked. My attorney slowly removed his glasses before answering. "The truth." Those words somehow seemed far heavier than anyone expected. He quietly handed the first document to the detective sitting across from us. "You've spent the last several days attempting to determine why someone has targeted Miss Emily Carter." "That's correct. The answer is quite simple." He paused briefly before continuing. "They weren't targeting her." Suddenly, the entire room became silent. "What do you mean?" Emily asked softly. "They've been targeting someone else all along." I quietly lowered my eyes toward the table without saying another word. "Who?" my daughter asked in confusion. Slowly, my attorney looked toward me before finally answering, "Him." For several moments, no one spoke. Then my son-in-law quietly laughed, as though believing he had misunderstood what he had just heard. "That's impossible." "I'm afraid it isn't." My daughter slowly turned toward me in confusion. "Dad?" I smiled sadly before gently taking her hand in mine. "There are some things I should have told all of you many years ago." No one knew what to say. For 9 years, my family had believed they understood exactly why I disappeared from their lives. The truth was that none of them knew even half of the story. My attorney quietly opened the sealed envelope I had protected for so many years before removing several official documents. The accusations made against Mr. Carter 9 years ago were never as simple as everyone was led to believe. The detective immediately began reviewing the documents before suddenly looking toward me in complete disbelief. "This isn't possible." "I'm afraid it is." "What is it?" Emily asked anxiously. For several moments, the detective simply stared at me before finally speaking. "These documents were sealed under a federal protection agreement." My daughter's face immediately turned pale. "What does that mean?" "It means," my attorney answered quietly, "that not everything reported 9 years ago was true." Suddenly, the room seemed almost impossibly quiet. For years, they believed I had simply accepted the consequences of my own choices. No one knew that I had also been protecting something far more important than my own future. Emily slowly looked toward me before asking the question I had feared for 9 long years. "What did you do, Grandpa?" I smiled softly before gently brushing away the tears beginning to form within her eyes. "I protected my family." "From what?" I remained silent. Because some truths cannot be told all at once. They must be carried carefully from one broken heart to another. "I promised your grandmother that no matter what happened, I would always protect the people we love." "You lost 9 years of your life." "No." "What?" I smiled quietly before looking toward every member of my family sitting around that table. "I spent 9 years keeping my promise." For the first time since arriving at the police station, I saw tears slowly begin falling down my daughter's face. And suddenly I realized something else had finally begun changing that morning. It wasn't only my granddaughter's future that was being saved. It was my family. For 9 years, we had allowed silence to become stronger than love. Perhaps today, that silence was finally coming to an end. Then my attorney quietly placed one final document before the detective. Everything changed the moment he began reading it. He slowly looked toward me before asking only 4 words. "Why didn't you tell them?" I smiled sadly before giving him the only answer I had ever known. "Because they deserve peace." At that moment, I finally understood that protecting the people we love sometimes means allowing them to misunderstand us. And I would make exactly the same choice all over again if I had to. No one spoke for what felt like an eternity after the detective finished reading the final document resting before him. The silence inside that room was different now. It was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence that follows the truth. Emily was the first person to speak. "Grandpa," she whispered softly, "what really happened 9 years ago?" There are questions we spend our entire lives preparing ourselves to answer. Unfortunately, we are never truly ready when the moment finally arrives. I looked toward my daughter, sitting quietly beside her husband, before allowing my eyes to rest upon my granddaughter once again. "The story everyone knows isn't the story that happened," I answered honestly. My daughter immediately began crying. "What does that mean?" "It means there were things I wasn't allowed to tell anyone." "Why?" "Because telling the truth would have destroyed more lives than it could have saved." The detective quietly leaned back in his chair before speaking once again. "Mr. Carter voluntarily accepted responsibility for actions that were part of a federal investigation." Emily immediately turned toward me in confusion. "You didn't commit those crimes?" "No." "Then why did everyone believe you did?" I smiled sadly before answering the question that had remained buried inside my heart for almost 10 years. "Because I wanted them to." "What?" For the second time that day, the entire room became silent. "There were innocent people involved," I explained quietly. "People I loved." "Us?" my daughter asked through her tears. "Especially you." Suddenly, she began shaking her head in disbelief. "No," she whispered repeatedly. "No, that's impossible. I wish it were." My son-in-law slowly lowered his eyes toward the documents resting before him. "You protected us?" I couldn't help but laugh softly at the question. "That's what fathers do." Emily immediately grabbed my hand. "You spent 9 years alone because of us?" "No." "Grandpa, please stop saying that." The tears filling her eyes were breaking my heart all over again. "I never spent a single day regretting my choice." "How can you possibly say that?" "Because every sacrifice is worth making if the people we love are allowed to keep smiling afterward." She immediately began crying once again. For years, I had worried about this moment. I worried they would hate me for hiding the truth. I worried they would blame themselves for the years we lost together. Most of all, I worried they would look at me differently once they finally understood what happened. Strangely enough, none of those fears remained sitting beside me that afternoon. All I saw were the people I loved. Nothing else had ever mattered very much. My attorney quietly opened another file before handing it to the detective. The financial transactions involving Miss Emily were traced less than 2 hours ago. Everyone immediately looked toward him in surprise. "What did you find?" the detective asked. "The same organization connected to Mr. Carter's case almost 10 years earlier." Emily slowly covered her mouth in complete disbelief. "This has been about Grandpa all along?" "Yes." "They used me to get to him?" My attorney nodded quietly. "They knew he would come if you called him." For several moments, Emily simply stared at me without saying a single word. Then she smiled through her tears before whispering something that immediately brought tears to my own eyes. "I knew you would come too. Life has a beautiful way of returning the things we give freely to others. Years earlier, I promised myself that I would always come whenever my family needed me. Today, my granddaughter reminded me that she had never forgotten that promise." The detective quietly closed the file before speaking once again. "Miss Emily will not be charged." No one moved. No one spoke. It was almost as though none of us were capable of believing what we had just heard. "The investigation will proceed in another direction beginning immediately." For the first time in nearly 24 hours, I saw peace slowly returning to my granddaughter's eyes. She was finally going home. Nothing else mattered anymore. As she embraced me tightly, I quietly realized that perhaps I had been wrong about one thing all these years. I believed protecting my family meant carrying every burden alone. Perhaps what they needed most was never my silence. Perhaps they simply needed me. After 9 long years, I was finally beginning to understand that truth myself. The drive home should have felt different that evening. After all, my granddaughter was finally safe. The charges against her had been dropped. The truth was slowly finding its way back into our lives. For the first time in nearly 10 years, I should have felt nothing but peace. Instead, I found myself wondering whether my family could ever forgive the years we had lost together. Some wounds heal quickly. Others require time, patience, and love. Family wounds are often the most difficult of all. Emily refused to let go of my hand throughout the entire drive home. It was something she hadn't done since she was a little girl. Strangely enough, I didn't mind. I had spent 9 years missing moments exactly like this one. When we finally arrived at my house, she quietly looked toward me before asking, "Can I stay with you tonight?" "Of course." She smiled before laughing softly. "Good, because I wasn't asking." For the first time that day, all of us laughed together. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. My daughter remained unusually quiet throughout dinner that evening. Several times I caught her looking toward me before immediately lowering her eyes once again. Finally, after Emily had gone upstairs to call one of her closest friends, my daughter quietly spoke. "Dad?" "Yes?" "I'm sorry." Those two words seemed far heavier than any others I had heard that day. "You don't have anything to apologize for." "Yes, I do." There were tears filling her eyes now. "I spent 9 years believing things about you that weren't true." "No," I answered gently. "You spent 9 years believing what I allowed everyone to believe. But I should have been there." I smiled sadly before reaching across the table to hold her hand. "You were." She looked at me in confusion. "No, I wasn't. Every birthday card, every Christmas gift, every time Emily told me how proud she was of her mother, you were always there." Fresh tears slowly rolled down her face. "You missed everything because of me." "No." "What?" "I missed nothing." That answer surprised everyone sitting at the table. "You missed 9 years of your life," my son-in-law quietly said. "No," I answered once again. "I spent 9 years watching the people I love continue living theirs. There is a difference between losing time and giving it away." I had never considered my sacrifice a loss. I simply considered it love. For several moments, no one spoke. Then my daughter quietly asked the question she had been afraid to ask all day. "Did you ever hate us?" I couldn't help but smile. "Never. Not even once? Not even for a second." "But why?" The answer came more easily than I expected. "Because you're my family." People often believe forgiveness is something extraordinary. I've never understood why. Forgiving the people we love has always felt perfectly ordinary to me. Love without forgiveness isn't love at all. My daughter suddenly stood from her chair before quietly walking toward me. Then, for the first time in 9 years, she wrapped her arms around me and began crying against my shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Dad. There aren't many moments in life beautiful enough to make us forget our pain. That moment was one of them." 9 years of distance quietly disappeared inside a simple embrace. My son-in-law smiled as he wiped away his own tears before finally speaking. "You know," he laughed softly, "I've spent 15 years trying to impress you." That surprised me enough to make me laugh. "What?" "You've always frightened me a little." Emily suddenly appeared at the doorway, laughing quietly. "He's not wrong, Grandpa." "Am I truly that frightening?" "No," she answered immediately before sitting beside me once again. "You've always been my hero." Those words affected me more deeply than she will ever know. Heroes are extraordinary people. I have never considered myself one. I am simply a grandfather who loves his family more than anything else in this world. That night, before everyone finally went home, Emily quietly handed me something I never expected. It was the small notebook she carried as a little girl. "I've kept it all these years," she whispered softly. Confused, I slowly opened the first page. Written carefully in the handwriting of an 8-year-old little girl were words I had completely forgotten saying. "Becoming a good person should never depend upon how other people treat us." I found myself unable to speak. "You taught me that," she said with tears filling her eyes. "I've carried it with me my entire life." For a moment, I realized that perhaps we never truly understand the impact our love leaves behind in the lives of those we care about. The greatest things we give our children and grandchildren are rarely money or success. They're the small lessons we leave quietly within their hearts. As I gently closed the notebook resting in my hands, I realized that perhaps I hadn't sacrificed 9 years of my life after all. Perhaps I had simply spent 9 years protecting everything that truly mattered. 3 months passed more quickly than I ever imagined. Life has a beautiful habit of quietly putting broken things back together whenever we are patient enough to let it. Emily returned to work only 6 weeks after the investigation officially ended. Not only was she welcomed back, but she was also offered a promotion she never expected to receive. The truth had finally done what the lies could never accomplish. It set her free. Watching her smile again became my favorite part of every Sunday afternoon. Some people spend their entire lives searching for happiness in extraordinary places. I've discovered it usually waits quietly beside an ordinary dinner table filled with the people we love. There were other changes happening within our family as well. My daughter began visiting every weekend without fail. Sometimes she brought dinner. Sometimes she simply sat beside me drinking coffee while we talked for hours about the years we could never get back. Oddly enough, neither of us spoke about regretting them very often. Regret has a terrible habit of stealing time we could spend being grateful instead. We had already lost enough time. Neither of us was interested in losing any more. My son-in-law remained exactly who he had always been, a good man, trying his best to become a better one. The only difference now was that he no longer looked at me as though I might secretly disapprove of him whenever we shared dinner together. Instead, he treated me exactly as I had always hoped he would, like family. One afternoon, he quietly laughed while helping me repair the old fence surrounding my garden. "Can I confess something?" "That depends," I answered jokingly. He smiled before shaking his head. "I used to think you hated me." That immediately made me laugh. "Why would I hate you?" "Because I never felt good enough for your daughter." For several moments, I simply smiled at the young man standing beside me. "You've spent 15 years loving my family," I finally answered. "That has always been more than enough for me." He didn't say another word after that. He simply smiled before returning to his work. Emily continued visiting more than anyone else. Sometimes she stopped by after work simply to sit beside me for 30 minutes before driving home again. One evening, she quietly asked me a question I wasn't expecting. "Do you ever wish things had happened differently?" I smiled before looking toward the photograph of my wife resting quietly upon the bookshelf. "Every day." "Then why don't you regret your choice?" "Because those are two very different things." She remained silent, waiting patiently for me to continue. "If I could protect all of you without losing those 9 years, I would choose that future every single time. And if you couldn't?" I smiled softly before taking her hand in mine. "Then I would choose exactly the same life all over again." There are moments in life when we finally understand whether our sacrifices were worthwhile. For me, that moment wasn't standing inside the police station. It wasn't hearing the truth finally revealed after 9 long years. It wasn't even watching my family slowly come back together again. It happened quietly one Sunday afternoon. Emily had fallen asleep, resting her head upon my shoulder, while my daughter prepared lunch inside the kitchen. My son-in-law was arguing playfully with me about whether pineapple belongs on pizza, and laughter filled every corner of my home once again. For several moments, I simply sat there listening to the people I love laugh together. Then I quietly realized something that immediately brought tears to my eyes. I wasn't getting my family back. I had never truly lost them. Love had been patiently waiting for us this entire time. All we needed to do was find our way back home. A few weeks later, Emily surprised me with a framed photograph she placed beside my wife's picture inside the living room. "What is this?" I asked, smiling. She laughed softly before kissing my forehead. "Proof that heroes don't wear capes." Confused, I slowly picked up the photograph resting before me. It was taken the day she graduated from law school. I was sitting quietly in the very last row, smiling proudly at her as she walked across the stage. I had always believed no one noticed I was there that day. I was wrong. Turning the photograph over, I found words written carefully across the back in her beautiful handwriting. "Is greater than Grandpa. Thank you for always coming when I need you most. I hope one day I become even half the person you've always believed I could be. I love you, forever." There are very few moments in life capable of leaving us speechless. That was one of mine. Today, people sometimes ask me whether sacrificing 9 years of my life was worth it. My answer has never changed. I would gladly sacrifice everything I have if it means protecting the people I love. After all, I was never protecting my family's future. They were protecting mine too. And if life ever gave me the opportunity to live it all over again, there is only one thing I would change. I would hug them sooner.